Hey everyone, so here we are for the last lecture in this video series here. Severe weight loss. We're going to look at this primarily in the frame of performance and athletics and what happens with those individuals when they strive or drive too far into the goal of weight loss. Uh, and the other component of that to keep in mind while we're going through this is even for the general population, a lot of these similar concepts will still apply. However, it's perhaps a little bit less noticeable when there's a performance or not a performance aspect close at hand as well to observe. So, what I mean by that is if someone is participating in a sport, it's easy to see sooner potentially when they're not getting adequate enough caloric intake because performance will start to suffer and continually suffer until that's mitigated. Excuse me. So, again, this can happen not just after a prolonged period of time of having low caloric intake, but some of these points that we'll speak to can also happen during a crash or very short-term dramatic decrease in calories as well. And they often come with negative health effects. So, speaking to that point again that was made earlier, where being overweight or obese, in particular, is particularly troubling because of the negative health consequences that are associated with that. Again, primarily cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, joint and skeletal issues as well. But if the pendulum swings to the other side of the spectrum, and we look at what happens when weight loss becomes too severe, we'll see some of these effects. So, again, primarily shows up in sport as negatively or poor performance. One of the ways that occurs with severe weight loss is through dehydration. And oftentimes you'll see a lot of people on weight loss regimes. And that was a tip that we had earlier from one of the previous lectures, is to drink water. And so that's to try to avoid dehydration when you're cutting calories. So a lot of our food actually hydrates us. There's a lot of water content in a lot of foods that are good for us. So so as we decrease that, we can also decrease our water intake. So that's something to be aware of. And with that dehydration, and it only takes about 3 to 4% of our total body mass before our aerobic performance gets affected. But that's primarily through this means of our glycogen storage. So if you remember back to some of our metabolic content where, again, our aerobic and anaerobic systems need to pull from some sort of carbohydrates. In particular, we can pull from our glycogen storage, which is glucose stored in muscles. And so what we'll find is with dehydration, or this sometimes rapid loss of weight due to fasting, so long periods without adequate calories, or severe restriction of calories, we'll see that glycogen will actually leave with some of this water. And it's a lot of the time because glycogen is stored or released with water or fluids as we start to release that. So the magnitude, of course, depends on the sport. So, for example, if our activity isn't so demanding to really reach into our glycogen stores, say we meet our glucose needs, or we are heavily relying on fats for activities. So let's say an aerobic heavy activity at a low intensity, that would be primarily fats or aerobic respiration for that. And debatably, our carbohydrate needs would be met through either glyconeogenesis, so creating new glucose, or potentially through light intake of some sort of carbohydrates, then we'd be good. But of course, our heavy anaerobic or very high intense, long duration aerobic activities that would drive into our anaerobic systems, they definitely need glycogen storage, and thus we'd see significant performance deficits from that. There's this great casually explained video. It's this YouTube series by a guy who I feel he's pretty funny, I think, and he speaks to how unless you're doing like 100-kilometer runs where your actual effort level typically is quite low relative to your threshold, you will need carbohydrates to perform. So yeah, anyway, if you ever, I have it linked, so if you ever have a chance to watch that and any of his other videos, I think they're quite clever. So generally well researched. So right, so we're speaking about athletes and their decrease of performance. There's a few things related to that, or there's a bit of like a name that we might call that, and that's relative energy deficit in sport, or RED-S. And this has kind of taken the place of what for a long time has been called the female triad. So we'll speak to what that is specifically for women in a moment. But RED-S is a bit more applicable to both men and women because there has been enough research now that goes to show that certainly men who also aren't getting enough energy to meet their energy requirements for sports see deficits and decreases in their performance. For example, lower testosterone, decreased capacity to rest and therefore recover. A lot of these things as well, like irritability and lack of or poor impaired judgment. So there's a lot of these factors play into men when they enter this lack of energy state. And what's interesting is this area of study is probably one of the fewer areas where the men or the male side of health research is actually less than that of the female side. The female triad, the female triad is really well researched, whereas the RED-S in particular, when applied to men, is not. So it's a bit of a burgeoning area. So what is the female triad? I've spoken about that a few times. Well, it's when three things present in a female athlete or highly active women. And it's a menstrual cycle irregularity, so typically lack of menses. There's osteoporosis that develops, and from that reduced energy availability, there may or may not be an eating disorder. So what we see from all of this is a decrease in performance and an increased risk of injury if you think of in light of osteoporosis in particular. And so what we'll see, again, to speak to the eating disorders, so occasionally you can just have a lack of nutrient intake. Again, maybe certain athletes are just really focused on maintaining a certain low body fat mass due to performance. But what can occur from that is either anorexia nervosa, so a lack of taking in nutrients, and this and somewhat of an obsession towards exercise. So again, you get that really big drive or imbalance of too much exercise, not enough calories, and so something like the female triad, amongst other health concerns, can arise. Bulimia nervosa is binge eating followed by purging. And what's interesting, I guess, that maybe isn't noted here is that there can also be like a binge type behavior towards exercise as well. So something to keep in mind if you're working with athletes And generally, these tend to occur at a higher frequency in sports that also are heavy into aesthetics as well. So, dance, gymnastics, figure skating, sports like that. And in those sports in particular, they found both a relatively well, what they're finding, it depends on what year you're looking at the research, but they're finding a more trend towards some more equal rates of these eating disorders in those sports between men and women. Sorry. Last but not least, we are here. We'll take a look at this diagram. And I actually feel this helps illustrate exactly what's going on with the female triad quite nicely. So on this end, or this purple triangle up here, this is what we'll see in a good or optimal energy availability. So getting enough calories in relative to the amount that you're expending. Maybe that small deficit that we've spoken about before, 100, couple hundred calories a day. But generally, you're plus or minus that on any given day. You're menstruating as expected, and you have optimum bone health in this situation. When we get into a state, or women get into a state where they have reduced energy availability, so regardless of an eating disorder or not, perhaps you just have a huge training load and you're not being able to get enough calories in to sustain that activity. What will tend to happen is you'll have this functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. So that means no menorrhea or no menses, so no period. What happens there is your gonadal releasing hormone, if you can remember back to the hormone, or the endocrine system, stops getting released from the hypothalamus. So the pituitary doesn't go on and release, say, FSH or LH, so follicle stimulating hormones or luteinizing hormones or gonadotropic hormones. And so then we'll see a lack of period in that case. And what happens with that is when women, let's say, go through menopause, when they're 40, typically you stop having your period. And what we tend to find at that point in time is women are at a much higher rate to develop osteoporosis. So potentially, physicians will prescribe hormone supplementation in order to help counteract that, in addition to things like calcium and weight-bearing activities to try to encourage good bone health. But yes, and so what will happen is once you get to this point where you start becoming potentially osteoporotic in sport, if you think about how many forces go through the body and how much impact the body can take during different sports, like for example, figure skating, you glide to propel yourself or locomote around the ice while you're skating, but falling when you're practicing new jumps or just generally taking a fall can be potentially quite serious if your bones aren't strong, right? So I think hopefully that gives you a good example and illustration as to how the female triad works. And again, this terminology is, I think, slowly it'll be present, as we move forward. But generally speaking, now you can say red S, and that will refer to men and women who have a deficiency in energy.